Okay, great, everyone. Welcome to this workshop on a Buddhist perspective on grief and loss. We're going to start today with just a short little meditation. I call this kind of a healing meditation, but it's just an opportunity for us to come into this space, to get in touch with our hearts a bit more. So we'll begin as we usually do with just kind of a few minutes of watching the breath, and then I'll lead you in a short guided meditation. So find a comfortable position, one where you feel kind of the body supported, somewhat upright, alert, but also kind of relaxing into this posture so that there's as little tension in the body as possible. And again, you can begin to pay attention to the breath in whatever way suits your mind. If you want a suggestion, I often suggest the point at the tip of the nose, particularly when we're meditating in the evening. It's kind of nice to choose something that's in the upper part of the body. If you meditate on like the lower abdomen or what have you, that can kind of bring the mind down, and we might already be tired from the day. So whatever way you choose to work with the breath, just try to stay present with the breath. And then whenever you notice that something has distracted you from the breath, taken you away, let go of that and bring your awareness back to the breath. So I'll ring the bowl here from my side. I don't know how this comes across in the recording or how you hear it. But anyway, I'll do a short ringing of the bell and then we will begin our meditation. I'll come in just a few minutes to lead you in this healing meditation. So first, let's bring our awareness to the body. So as you continue breathing, just kind of assess where you're at physically at this moment. Just simply take note without any judgment as I guide you with the following questions. Is your body relaxed or rigid? Is it loose or tight? Does your body feel energized or fatigued? Is the energy in the body moving freely, or is it somewhat sluggish or constricted? Is the energy flowing fully throughout the body, or is it stuck in places? Again, just take note without any judgment. Where are you at physically? And now we'll bring our awareness to our mind and assess where we're at mentally. And again, as before, without any judgment, simply take note as I guide you with the following questions. Is your mind calm or stressed? Is it clear or is it foggy? Is your mind vibrant or is it tired? And just take a few minutes to observe the mind. Kind of look at what the mental landscape is like. What is your mental energy like? Your clarity, your focus. Just take note again without any judgment. And now bring your awareness to your heart center, the heart chakra, the level of the heart, but in the center of the chest. And mentally just try to be present in that space of being at the heart center. And try to simply let go of all the various events of the day or the week. And try to simply be present in your heart center, just abiding there. And then from that space, the center of your chest, as you exhale, release any rigidity or fatigue in the body, any constriction of energy or stuck places, any foggy mindedness, stress, or other things in your mind that you wish to be free from, that you wish to let go of. As you exhale, simply feel that all going away, exhaling it out, clearing the mind, energizing the body. And as you inhale, invite into your heart all the relaxation, energy, calmness, clarity, or anything else that you wish to receive. Feel your heart open, soften, and expand. So just do this inhalation of all of what you wish to receive, an exhalation of all that you wish to let go of. Just abiding in the heart center as you do this. And then now begin to send that same energy, relaxation, calmness, and openness to all the other hearts that are here in this virtual room with us. Feel the spacious connection. Feel that heart connection to others who are here with you tonight. And just be in that space of support, of love, of connection. And then finally, from this place of our own heart center, we make our motivation for being here for tonight as well as this weekend. We can think about how we ourselves want to heal, want to have all that we need right now to help us find peace, calm. But how we also want to do this work with the aim to support others in their process of healing. Just have that kind of dual motivation. Yourself to be free of all that disturbs or blocks you, and others to also have that same freedom. And we'll do this work this weekend with that combined aim of both ourselves and others. You can open your eyes fully when you're ready, and we'll begin. So again, welcome everyone to this three-part weekend workshop that we're doing on grief. I'm going to talk a little bit more about things in just a moment, but I did want to have introductions so that, and again, I don't feel like you have to share a whole lot at this point. We'll have another opportunity for people to share perhaps at the start of tomorrow morning's class. But at this point, it would be nice if you could just let me know who you are and maybe just a little bit about why you're here. Again, you don't have to go into great detail. As we're going to get into and talking about grief, we're all going to be at different places in terms of what we're experiencing or what we identify as grief, perhaps that we are going through, or maybe we're just curious about this topic of grief. And so I'll go ahead and begin just so everybody doesn't feel like you're on the spot to begin when I open it up to other introductions. But so again, most of you know me, a number of you know me, Don Handrick. I'm a former resident teacher at Tupten Norbuling Center here in Santa Fe. And I've been a more or less touring teacher over the pandemic, but I've been virtually touring, not doing any physical touring until a couple of months ago when I began touring again. But I've been a teacher for the FPMT since 2005. And I'm just very happy to be with all of you here. I will mention again that I have done this workshop on grief once before, and I will be doing it once more next month, actually, when I'm in Florida. But I think it's a really important topic for people to be able to explore. There's not quite so much in Buddhist literature about it, and so I'm hoping that you'll find some value in coming together to do this weekend. So that's maybe enough of an introduction from me as to why I'm here and what I'm hoping we can do together this weekend in this workshop. So I'll leave it open again if you would like to come in and at least introduce yourself. Maybe I will call on people just to make it easier so people aren't sort of waiting and not sure, who should chime in. Maybe we could begin with Vanessa. Thank you, Vanessa, again for coordinating this through Gonpo Ludup study group. So please.
All right, I am Vanessa. I am from Orange County, California, and I invited Don to do this because I did attend the one he taught last year. So, and why I'm so intrigued by this topic is because I think Buddhism provides an explanation about death that is just, for me, that makes sense. Also, my mom passed away a little bit more than a year ago. So I'm still grieving from that. So yeah, that's why I am here.
Thank you, Vanessa. By the way, we are recording this, so if you don't want any of your presence here recorded, just maybe just put your little signal on. You've got the reactions thing. You can put the little hand up, and then we'll make sure to mute you when you come on to share. Is everyone clear on that? So anyway, I just don't want people, again, to be uncomfortable with any of the things that might be shared on the taping of this. So Peggy, would you mind going next?
My name is Peggy. I live southeast of Denver in a community called Centennial, Colorado. And I lost my husband a little less than a year ago. September 7th will be the 1-year anniversary of his death. And he was a practicing, sorry about that. He was a practicing Buddhist, and I want to know more about it. It's been a difficult year. I've been going through ups and downs of the grieving process of being widowed. So I'd just like to know more about, sorry, my dog. I'd just like to know more about the whole grieving process from a Buddhist perspective, because it seems much more amenable than other types of practices that I'm familiar with. So let me get my dog.
Great. Thank you, Peggy, for sharing. She's gone to get her dog, so maybe she's not here. There she is. Okay. Thank you. And again, I'm sorry to hear about Vanessa's loss of her mother, and of course, your loss of your husband too, Peggy. And again, I appreciate both of you being here to be able to explore it with, again, the grief being perhaps a bit fresher than certainly what I'm experiencing at this point. So, but thank you both. Let's go to Lorna.
Yes, I live in Victoria, BC, Canada. And when I saw the name of this workshop, I just was curious to find out about it from a Buddhist perspective. I've experienced a lot of grief, loss in my life, in my family and friends. And I've also spent many years working with elderly people and their families. And it's just something I've noticed in general society, that death and dying is a really uncomfortable subject by and large. And most people can't handle it, don't even like to say the word death, dying. We use other words to avoid those words. And so I'm just curious to find out about it from a Buddhist perspective.
Right. Thank you, Lorna. Glad you joined for that reason. It's good to have you here. If we could go to Don, please.
Hi, Don. It's so good to see you. Thank you so much for doing these teachings. I've experienced loss, nothing as fresh and I've gone through my own grieving process, but I'm so interested more in depth on the process, and I've been studying how to make friends with death with Lama Zopa Rinpoche. I would love to help in that process for people if I ever get the chance, So I'm just grateful that you're teaching on this subject. Thank you, Don.
Thank you, Don, for being here. It's good to see you again as well. Yeah, Don lives here in Santa Fe as well, connected through Tipton Norberling. So, all right, let's go on to Carol, please.
Yes, I'm Carol, and I also live in Orange County. I'm not too far away from Vanessa in Laguna Woods. And I find that, particularly at my age, which is just close to 84, I have friends who are losing spouses, or another good friend who just lost her mother 2 days ago and is just at the very beginning of that grieving process. I lost my husband just a little over 2 years ago. So I feel like I've been blessed with lots of wonderful teachers and support systems to help me through that. but I find myself now sort of in that position of being the person to help others that are really close to me, friends and family who are now fresh at the very beginning of those kinds of grieving issues. So that's why I'm here tonight, to learn more about how to deal with that. Thank you for
Right.
being here too. It's great.
Oh, I'm glad you're here, Carol. And we will try to touch on this topic of kind of supporting others in their grief as part of the weekend. Won't be the main topic, but we'll definitely, touch on that. It is important that we are able to use our own experience and our own, knowledge to help others. So good. Thanks, Carol. And let's go to Sasha.
Hi, sorry I'm late, but I'm glad I'm here. I just am looking at getting out of samsara, and grief takes us into samsara. So, but at the same time, we can't ignore our feelings. So I would say that in my life, I've had many losses that many of them I don't think I really grieved or didn't grieve properly, and just kind of went on and ran around, in a flight pattern around the world most of my life. And so, I don't really want to go into the dukkha, but, but I just thought I'd put my toe in the water tonight and see. That's
Right.
it.
Wonderful, Sasha. Yes. Yeah, we'll get into all of these topics about, grief fitting into the overall Buddhist structure of teachings and what have you. Because like you said, it's kind of both. We don't want to experience this pain and grieving and loss and what have you, but nonetheless, while we have it, we do have to experience it and go through it. So we'll get into that. Thanks. Glad you're here, Sasha. Christopher, if you wouldn't mind.
I am Christopher Harris. I'm in Santa Fe, New Mexico as well. And Don, it's so glad to see you. We've missed you terribly. I lost my father recently, and I just realized I'm not prepared for grief or death in any Western or Eastern way. And I've been watching Don learn quite a bit about death and dying, and I just realized I know nothing, and I just want to be of more help than I've been in the past. And I want to be a little more knowledgeable about the Buddhist philosophy around grief and dying. So I was very excited to see this course come up. Thank you.
Wonderful. Good to see you too, Christopher. And I'm glad that you're here. Again, sorry to hear about your father's loss. The father's death, that's really difficult, when we go through that. Anyway, we'll get more into that again, but I'm glad that you're here and taking the opportunity to explore grief with us. So good. All right, let's go on to Whitney, the last one.
Whitney, oh, there.
Hi, there's actually two of us. There's me and my housemate, Alexandra. And I would like to broaden my Buddhist practice and understand more about what the Buddhist philosophy is around grieving, and maybe help myself to heal a little better, and again, be able to help others.
Great. Thanks, Whitney. Yes. And Alexandra, did you want to say something as well?
Thank you for the opportunity to listen to some wisdom that maybe I wouldn't have had access to other than through Whitney. And I have had quite a bit of loss, not people, but more of the hopes and dreams kind of loss, and attachment, lots of attachment that was very sudden. So just looking for guidance.
Good. Well, I'm glad that you're here, Alexandra. I hope that the weekend can provide you with some of that. Yeah, and this is a kind of what we're getting into and working with grief is the whole idea of this not being, although again, many of you might be experiencing the loss of a loved one, someone very dear to you, as you've expressed, and some of us certainly have had that in our lives at various times. But we're really talking about the whole process of loss that we all are dealing with on a almost continual basis. In fact, one reason why I wanted to explore this topic of grief more was I saw an article shortly after the pandemic started. I think it was in March 23rd of 2020. I mean, within like a couple of weeks of when everything started shutting down. And the article was essentially saying that that uneasy feeling you have, it's grief. And we were all going through grieving at that time, but probably didn't realize it. We probably didn't identify it as that. And of course, this is because we have a continual process of what I think Guy Newland in his book, he calls these micro griefs. We're going to talk about that a little bit later, but it's stuff that is happening almost all the time. The letting go of certain things that we have in our lives, that a change, that transitions that we're constantly going through. So this is what we're going to be working with, is kind of the idea of grief having a much larger context, though obviously I'm going to at times try to deal with it more in terms of the people that we lose and the more profound grief perhaps, or maybe profound might not be quite the right word, but certainly the more difficult forms of grief that we have when people who we love in our lives have been taken from us, or we don't have that experience of them in our lives in that way any longer. What I'd like to do is to kind of get things going is to share a little bit about my history. So I feel that if I sort of put my my heart out there and explain sort of my own background and what's transpired with grief in my life, that it sort of gives perhaps some permission for each of you to be as open as you wish to with regard to this weekend. But as I said, there is the always that possibility, if you do want to share something, if you don't want it recorded, just let us know. You can even just say that first, please stop the recording, and we'll pause the recording for that time, and then we'll resume it when you have finished with your comments. So I actually came to Buddhism out of the experience of the death of my first partner. This was back in 1992. He died of AIDS in August of that year. And in fact, it was just the 30th anniversary of that on August 12th when Ed passed away. And for me, and I will share some other experiences perhaps of my time in working with my grief, as well as even anticipatory grief, which is something that I'm going through a little bit right now. I just got back from a visit with my mother, who's 92 years old and is doing okay. But every time I leave after seeing her, I have that feeling of this could be the last time. Of course, we know from Buddhist teachings that any time could be the last time. I could go before her. There's no order to this necessarily. But so anyway, when I experienced the loss of my partner, I was really looking for answers to questions. Of course, I hadn't explored Buddhism so much. I'd gotten involved in a number of things like Tai Chi and other various Eastern philosophies and things while I was living in San Francisco. But I really hadn't explored Buddhism. A wonderful book called The Tibetan Book of Living and Dying came out by Sogyal Rinpoche in 1992. And Ed's brother was living in San Francisco, and he said, "What would you like for Christmas?" That's of course after Ed's passing, and I'm like going, I don't know, I think I need something that's really useful rather than anything, that would be just a regular Christmas gift. And so I suggested that he buy me that book. And I began reading it like crazy in 1993 and actually went on retreat with Sogyal Rinpoche and about 499 other people at Mount Madonna Center in the Bay Area. So I basically found the Buddhist path through my grief. And of course, my own grief is my own personal story of my relationship with Ed and how various things unfolded. And again, I may share bits and pieces of that as well. But if it wasn't for my grief, I don't think I'd be on this path, perhaps. Really was calling to me to answer questions that Buddhism does answer to some degree about death, life, what is it all about. I grew up Catholic and I never found satisfactory answers in that tradition in terms of being able to put it all in context and make sense of it. And Buddhism really spoke very clearly to me especially the teachings that Sogyal Rinpoche gave at that retreat, as well as in that book. And so for me, one of the most profound stories, I'm going to share it with you, and you may have heard of this story before, that comes from the time of the Buddha, about a woman named Krisha Gotami. And Sogyal Rinpoche, in his third chapter of Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, shares this story. So it's story time for a little bit tonight, and I appreciate your patience while I read this, but I think it's important to use Sogyal Rinpoche's words. He was my first teacher in Tibetan Buddhism, and this story really resonated with me as I went through my own grief and loss. So he says, when Krisha Gotami's firstborn child was about a year old, it fell ill and died. Grief-stricken and clutching its little body, Krisha Gotami roamed the streets, begging anyone she met for a medicine that could restore her child to life. Some ignored her, some laughed at her, some thought she was mad, but finally she met a wise man who told her that the only person in the world who could perform the miracle she was looking for was the Buddha. So she went to the Buddha, laid the body of her child at his feet, and told him her story. The Buddha listened with infinite compassion, and then he said gently, "There is only one way to heal your affliction. Go down to the city and bring me back a mustard seed from any house in which there has never been a death." Krisha Gotami felt elated and set off at once for the city. She stopped at the first house she saw and said, "I have been told by the Buddha to fetch a mustard seed from a house that has never known death." "Many people have died in this house," she was told. She went on to the next house. "There have been countless deaths in our family," they said. And so to a third and a fourth house, until she had been all around the city and realized the Buddha's condition could not be fulfilled. She took the body of her child to the charnel ground and said goodbye to him for the last time, then returned to the Buddha. "Did you bring the mustard seed?" he asked. "No," she said, "I am beginning to understand the lesson you are trying to teach me. Grief made me blind, and I thought that only I had suffered at the hands of death." "Why have you come back?" asked the Buddha. "To ask you to teach me the truth," she replied, "of what death is, what might lie behind and beyond death, and what in me, if anything, will not die." The Buddha began to teach her, "If you want to know the truth of life and death, you must reflect continually on this. There is only one law in the universe that never changes, that all things change and that all things are impermanent. The death of your child has helped you to see now that the realm we are in, samsara, is an ocean of unbearable suffering. There is one way and one way only out of samsara's ceaseless round of birth and death, which is the path to liberation. Because pain has now made you ready to learn and your heart is open to the truth, I will show it to you." Krisha Gotami knelt at his feet and followed the Buddha for the rest of her life. Near the end of it, it is said, she attained enlightenment. So it's a very inspiring story in many ways, but a very grounding story. Kind of tells us right from the beginning that this is the reality for all of us, which is not meant to in any way belittle or diminish our grief. Because as was pointed out by the Buddha, it was actually through her grief that her heart opened to the possibility of there being some deeper meaning, some deeper purpose, something that she could learn and be revealed to her through the Buddha's compassion and kindness and wisdom that she was ready for at that time. And of course, that story spoke to me in particular because that was how I came to Buddhism, was feeling my own grief and trying to make sense of all of it and to recognize that these teachings in Buddhism were the answer, was giving me exactly what I needed. Again, I'm not trying to advertise Buddhism. Those of you who are new to Buddhism, there's some wonderful things within it. There's also some difficult things, we'll maybe touch on a few of those as we go through the weekend. But this is really one of the most fundamental truths that the Buddha taught, the truth of impermanence. Impermanence is the ground upon which death is rooted. Death is a grosser form of impermanence when this life goes out of existence. But impermanence is around us all the time. We often call this subtle impermanence, the fact that everything changes, everything is in flux. And of course, we're blind to this, right? When as things happen to our bodies, or as our bodies are aging, we do notice it, but we tend to have a lot of resistance to it. And of course, in our culture, there's a lot of embracing the idea of everything being youthful and looking beautiful all the time. And of course, as people age and their bodies deteriorate, it's a difficult process for people to go through. But that process, again, is going on all the time. In fact, my teacher in Italy, Geshe, he said that it's really fortunate that we don't go to bed at the age of 16 and wake up with an 80-year-old body, because we would have a heart attack right there on the spot. There are kind of earth-shaking things about aging that, because of the gradual change that we have, we don't experience quite as profoundly. But death is certainly one of those things that, when it does happen, when we lose people in our lives, or when we have very sudden shifts in our lives where we lose other things, then we definitely have those opportunities to kind of see the stark reality of impermanence, to have that kind of be in our face and recognize that it's a time to learn then. Just like Krisha Gotami, we kind of open up our hearts and recognize that this is our perfect opportunity to actually embrace the truth. And the truth of impermanence is something that we really cannot deny. I want to share another story that comes from kind of the Japanese Zen tradition. It's actually from a book called The Essential Haiku. And it's basically the various haiku by Basho, Busan, and Issa. And this story is actually about Issa, a wonderful haiku poet. And he wrote a work of prose, more or less, with some poems in it, called A Year of My Life. And essentially what this came from was the fact that when his daughter was just under a year old, she died of smallpox. And this was a very profound loss for Issa. And he writes about it in A Year of My Life. So what I'm going to do is actually read the little introduction. And then on the screen, actually, I'll share the poem, the haiku that he wrote, that is kind of an expression of this feeling that comes about when we do have loss in our lives, that speaks to impermanence. So he says here, it is a commonplace of life that the greatest pleasure issues ultimately in the greatest grief. Yet why is it that this child of mine, who has not tasted half the pleasures that the world has to offer, who ought by rights to be as fresh and green as the vigorous young needles of the everlasting pine, why must she lie here on her deathbed, swollen with blisters, caught in the loathsome clutches of the vile god of smallpox? Being as I am her father, I can scarcely bear to watch her withering away, a little more each day, like some pure, untainted blossom that is ravished by the sudden onslaught of mud and rain. After 2 or 3 days, however, her blisters dried up, and the scabs began to fall away, like a hard crust of dirt that has been softened by melting snow. In our joy, we made what we call a priest in a straw robe. We poured hot wine ceremoniously over his body and packed him and the god of smallpox off together. Yet our hopes proved to be vain. She grew weaker and weaker, and finally on the 21st of June, as the morning glories were just closing their flowers, she closed her eyes forever. Her mother knew well it was no use to cry, that water once flown past the bridge does not return, and blossoms that are scattered are gone beyond recall. Yet, try as I would, I could not, simply could not cut the binding cord of human love. And this is the haiku that he wrote to express his feelings at that time. I have to get it to the slide here. Should have set this up before. Let's just go ahead and go down to that. Then I'll get it on the slideshow another time. And it's really quite profound. The world of dew is the world of dew. And yet, when I first read this, of course, it really brought tears to me, because this is one of the most stark realities that we have to deal with, is we deal with this world of dew, with things dissipating. The morning dew comes and then it evaporates and is gone. Everything constantly changing all around us. And yet, when we are affected so profoundly by the loss, as Isa was, of his young daughter here, of a parent, of a pet, of a loved one, whatever the case might be, then we often have those feelings of, yes, we understand impermanence, we kind of get it at a very intellectual level, but when we're faced with the reality of it, we still feel that it's unfair. There are many feelings, again, that we'll explore as part of this weekend that are triggered by our grief. So this is what we're going to be looking at again, is the reality of grief that is within the context of impermanence, within the context of something we can understand intellectually. But when grief happens, we have to get it at a very much deeper level, a more visceral level. And of course, this is the value of these experiences. This is the sort of gold within the experience of grief, the way that we can actually make value out of what we are experiencing. Of course, one of the other truths that the Buddha taught that is deeply rooted with all of this is the truth of suffering, of what again is dukkha. Was mentioned earlier. I think, I can't remember who that was that Sasha, I think, who mentioned it. So when we talk about dukkha, this term in Buddhism, the Sanskrit term, is essentially referring to the grosser forms of suffering that we experience, which grief is a part of. Anything that happens mentally or physically that is painful, that is anguish, that is that level of suffering. I often call this sort of in-your-face suffering. But of course, the Buddha taught that suffering goes much deeper. Dukkha actually encompasses a lot of different experiences that all can be deemed unsatisfactory. And this, of course, is why the path to liberation was taught by the Buddha, to help us to be free from this conditioned existence and all that is entailed within it. So this is something, again, that we'll explore later in this weekend, is kind of how we use grief being embedded within that idea of dukkha and samsara, and to understand it within that context, to perhaps use it to enhance our practice of the path. So before I get into some of the other things, let me go ahead and put on the screen, see if I can actually I want to go to my PowerPoint and cue it up a little bit better so that I can share it from here and not have it do what it did before. So these are the topics that I'm going to go through over the course of this weekend. So tonight is mostly the opening thoughts, and I'll begin to talk a bit about the nature of grief, the causes of grief. And again, I'm meaning for this to be a very exploratory and interactive weekend for all of us. So I'm going to give lots of opportunities for people to share, and I really encourage you to share. So after we go through kind of those initial topics, talk a bit about the necessity of grief. As I said, in our Buddhist teachings, we don't often talk about grief quite as much. And I think it is important that we do see it as something that we necessarily have to experience, especially when it becomes much deeper in our lives. The process of grieving. Talk a little bit about what Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in particular, her stages of dealing with death are applicable to grief. There was even a book that she wrote with David Kessler that was on grief and grieving, and share a little bit of that, because I think it is good to understand it from a Western perspective and the observations that have been done on the process of grieving. And then we'll go more into using grief on the path as we get towards the latter part of this course, and really going back to the Buddha's teachings and discerning how we are able to use what we are experiencing as a touchstone to be able to deepen our understanding of the path and to actually practice Buddhism at a much deeper level. So again, there was that little poem from Isa. Let's go into the topic of the nature of grief. And for this, I'm going to start off with just a basic definition of grief. Even though we've all been around grief, experienced grief, we sometimes don't think about putting words to it and what does it mean to describe grief. But then, of course, after this, I'm going to share another 4 slides or so that give different perspectives on grief on the basis of different teachers, different wise people that will share what they have to say. This is from the Free Dictionary. I often use this online. It seems to be a very good one in terms of giving us just pretty standard definitions. This is how we would look at it in a very factual sense. Grief is deep mental anguish as that arising from bereavement or an instance of this. I mean, it's very technical. It doesn't really say much. It doesn't give much flavor to what we mean by grief. Yes, it's a mental anguish I mean, one thing it doesn't touch on, which we will get into a little bit, is there's a physical component to grief as well. And so while it is identified primarily as a mental feeling, we can also feel grief in the body, and we'll touch on that a bit this weekend. Let's go into something that's a bit more descriptive in terms of people who are writing about grief with a bit more of the emotional understanding of it. This is from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler's book that I mentioned earlier. Grief is an emotional, spiritual, and psychological journey to healing. Again, they also don't include physical. I would include physical within that, but I think identifying it as something that we need to have a journey that involves an emotional component, because this is one of the deepest emotions that we will experience as living beings in this world. It's a spiritual experience. If we really look at the dimensions that we are going to go into this weekend, and not just within Buddhism, but certainly most traditions try to use it as a means of enhancing their spiritual practice and their spiritual understanding. And then, of course, the psychological journey, to be able to work with the mind and developing our own understanding of the feelings, where they come from, and so on, and be able to use that knowledge to help ourselves, and then also, as was touched on earlier, to help others with their healing. So, and as I said physical, I think physical is also a part of it. We do carry a lot of grief within our bodies, especially unprocessed grief, things that we haven't really worked through. And that can sometimes manifest in unease as well as disease. The diseases that often, come from that involve imbalances in the body due to us having that additional weight that we're carrying around with us. So I think there are many dimensions to the healing that happens through the process of dealing with grief. Another Buddhist teacher, Jack Kornfield, talks about grief in this way. He says, grief is one of the heart's natural responses to loss. And I like how he points that out right from the beginning. It is natural to grieve. And we wouldn't want to call it unnatural to not grieve, because I think that puts people in a category who don't grieve more openly, perhaps, to being called unnatural. But you have complete permission to grieve. It is natural to grieve. It is understandable within our interconnection with others that is going to be a response to loss, a response to losing others, as well as, again, all the dimensions of loss that we have in our lives. When we grieve, we allow ourselves to feel the truth of our pain, the measure of betrayal or tragedy in our life. By our willingness to mourn, we slowly acknowledge, integrate, and accept the truth of our losses. So I like this. It's a nice description about Buddhist perspective in many ways, because feeling the truth of our pain, as he says here, is really an important part of it. In Buddhism, we have a lot of these techniques that we call them mind training or lojong. And one of the main teachings within that is using suffering on the path, using the difficult things on the path. In fact, things we're going to touch on this weekend are very much in that vein, that we can actually use our suffering to help us to be more in touch with various understandings of the world that the Buddha taught, that begin with compassion for ourselves, that also embrace compassion for others and compassion for the entire world. But, we have to be able to experience the suffering if we're ever going to utilize it. And I think we get very judgmental around this, and that is also reinforced by our culture. This was mentioned earlier by someone that, Western culture doesn't do a very good job. I think it was Lorna, of embracing grief and loss and giving permission for people to grieve. In fact, we might be guilty of this ourselves when dealing with others who we know who are grieving and perhaps are not quite being sure what to do, and to be able to sit with someone in their grief and be present with them. It's very important that we allow that process to unfold and not try to get people to some point in the future that may come for them, but is not the point that they're at that stage of their grieving process. I think that we have to have that kind of respect for the truth of their pain, for being witness to their pain, bearing witness to what's going on for them. So these are all things that again, I think we don't do a very good job of, admittedly, I'll say that on behalf of Buddhism. I'm not speaking for everyone who's a Buddhist teacher or any Buddhist institution, but I can certainly say within the FPMT, the organization that Gonpo Ludup is a part of and that I'm a teacher for, that I don't see much attention being paid to this topic of grief. And over these past 2 years, so many people have experienced a variety of grief responses to loss that are in the nature of grief. Because it was losing a lot of things. Just even having the certainty that people had prior to that and the uncertainty that came up when suddenly we're dealing with this pandemic. And of course, I was just talking to somebody the other day and they were saying, remember the time when we thought this was going to be over in a couple of weeks? Everybody had that anticipation that this was not going to be something that would be changing our lives so drastically. And then moreover, causing the loss of so many people on this planet. So many of us perhaps have experienced friends, people that we know who have died from COVID, but certainly it's around us. I remember the relief I felt when finally in the US here, when President Biden did the ceremony shortly before his inauguration at the mirror, the reflection pool, I think it's called, in Washington, DC there. Just a permission for the country to grieve all of what had transpired to that point. And of course, we've experienced many losses since then. But grief is all around us all the time. Different levels, different stages, different intensities, but it's definitely a part of the fabric of our lives. And it's important that we kind of bear witness to it, understand the truth of it, feel the truth of our pain. And then this last part, by our willingness to mourn, we can then acknowledge, integrate, and accept the truth of our losses. Might mention one little phrase that I thought was really kind of interesting when I was doing some more reading. I try to read more books on grief every time I teach on this. I read a few before the previous time. I try to read one more before I teach this again in Florida next month. But a book that's by David Kessler that's actually called Finding Meaning, the sixth stage of what is it, dealing with grief? The sixth stage of grief, just sixth stage of grief. In that he talks about, I lost my train of thought by getting over there. Let me go back to what I was saying, what I was looking at. Sorry, just had a moment there. Acknowledge. Let me find it. I think I wrote it down here, and I can. Okay, sorry, it just kind of went out of my head. That does happen to me sometimes, especially in the evening when I'm teaching. So anyway, the idea here is that if we are able to kind of integrate into our own lives, our own understanding of loss, then we kind of come out the other side kind of bigger. Oh, I remember, that's what I was going to say. He said that, that there's this idea that our grief gets smaller over time. And maybe the experience of it does seem smaller, but he actually uses this phrase that I found really useful. He says, it's not that our grief gets smaller, it's that we get bigger. And that's kind of an important thing to keep in mind with regard to grief and how we're going to be exploring it this weekend. The idea is that grief is something that you're going to experience, something that for those of you who've lost people recently and are still experiencing some of the rawness of grief, it will still be there to some extent, even years from now. And some of you already know this from your own experiences with it. Even 30 years after losing my partner, I still have moments where it feels maybe, again, not as fresh as it did in 1992, but I know that the grief is still there. It's just that perhaps, again, I'm a little bit bigger. There's a little bit more space around it. The pain isn't quite so intense. And so this is, again, how we're going to be working with this and having an understanding of grief, that it is a process of us enlarging upon it, having a deeper understanding, a deeper acknowledgement, even a deeper integration of our losses, so that we kind of grow with those wounds. Let's go on to another sort of description of this. This is from Jamie Anderson, an author. I don't know what book of hers this is from, but she says, grief, I've learned, is really just love. It's all the love you want to give, but cannot. All that unspent love gathers up in the corners of your eyes, the lump in your throat, and in that hollow part of your chest. Grief is love with no place to go. Kind of like this idea, and actually there's another author, Her name is Joanne Cacciatore. She wrote a book called Bearing the Unbearable, but then she also wrote a smaller book that is called Grief is Loving. And really there is that kind of dual side to it. I suppose if we wanted to get rid of our grieving, then we would stop loving, because if we never love anything, if we never have any sort of closeness to the beings around us or what we are experiencing in this world, then we would be sheltered from that pain of having them be torn away from us. But because we love, because we have hearts, and because we feel the connection to others so deeply, we have the potential for that pain to be experienced. So this idea of grief being love finding no place to go, no object of that love, that object is absent. But it doesn't mean, again, that our love is gone. Our grief is a testimony to our love. And so there is that dual nature of grief, that it is a product, a byproduct of our love and our ability to connect with others and to connect with the good things in our lives and in our world. So this is also something to honor within grief, and to recognize that part of the process is to understand that we want to maintain the love through dealing with our grief, but recognize that our grief has its own sort of process to go through with regard to that. And losing our love for that person is not part of the formula. All right. And then Rabbi Earl Grolman says, grief is love not wanting to let go. I think this is another way of phrasing that, but I like this one as well, because we are forced to let go. And this is the reality of grief. I know when I first experienced the pain of losing Ed back in 1992, there was this intense sort of longing for his presence again, and the undeniable fact that that would never happen, that there was just no way that I would be able to have that direct experience that I had treasured for those years of being together. So again, this is love not wanting to let go is a good way to talk about grief as well. And of course, that goes to many things, many dimensions of our life. Although we use this term love, the fact is that we do also develop some sense of an attachment to what we have in our lives that brings us happiness, that brings us some contentment. And when those things are no longer in our lives, are absent from us, then there is that pain of grief, kind of wanting to have those things and wanting to experience it, but obviously not being able to have that. As I mentioned earlier, this idea of micro griefs, which is part of what we want to deal with this weekend as well, so that everyone can understand that these teachings on grief and loss apply to them, regardless of what you're experiencing. If you haven't had a very deep loss in your life, then you're blessed so far. No doubt every one of us experiences at least one, if not a number of those in our lives. But nonetheless, we all are grieving because we experience these moments of loss, these moments of grief. So this is, again, when we talk about the nature of grief in this first part, this is another thing to pay attention to. And here I will, share that quote from very nice book by Guy Newland, a Buddhist Grief Observed. Of course, there's the book by C.S. Lewis called A Grief Observed, I think when he lost his wife. And Guy Newland, his wife died of cancer, and he decided to do a Buddhist perspective on observing his own grief. And in the very first page of this book, he says, grief is the process of adjusting to unwanted change. And since change is unrelenting, again, recall the teachings on impermanence, we bear every day unrecognized microgriefs. And I think this is, he's pointing out one of the things about these microgriefs is that they become somewhat unrecognized. Now, I suppose if we were paying attention to every single moment of any type of loss or change in our lives and grieving it, we would probably never stop grieving. I don't think he's, by that idea of calling them unrecognized, that he wants us to recognize all of them and use them all at that level. But we do have to understand that this is something that we're continually dealing with. The Buddha did teach that one of the most painful things for beings in this world is their clinging to things as if they were unchanging. We do, even though we do accept change happening, obviously, I mean, at some level, change is happening all the time and we don't get completely upset every day of our lives. Nonetheless, we do keep hoping that we can get them to a place where we can fix them in time and hold on to them with some level of stability. In fact, the Buddha often points to the fact that this whole thought leads us to put a lot of emphasis on the external. And we have the idea in this world that if we kind of set our lives up correctly, we get the perfect partner with the perfect job and the perfect home and the perfect city with the perfect this and the perfect that. All of these external things kind of in place, that somehow we will then be kind of the winner. We have gotten what we wanted. And all of that attention on the external is faulty. Why? Because the external is not something we can rely upon in the end. It isn't stable. It does change all the time. And look at all the changes that we've all gone through in our lives, however old or young you consider yourself to be. You've gone through numerous changes, manifold changes, various things that you've had to let go of, new things that you've had to explore, various times in your life that were very challenging, other times that were very joyful. This is the nature of our lives. And if we put all of our emphasis on the external but ignore the internal, then we will have missed, a very precious opportunity, kind of not gone along with the understanding the Buddha has of what is really truth, that everything does change all the time and that we have to adjust ourselves to that reality. So these micro griefs are something that is a sort of an indicator for us, the thing that we have to deal with every day. Every day we wake up, we're another day older, another day closer to our own death. Everything is constantly on that circle. It was wonderful. I'm sure some of you saw the videos of Joni Mitchell singing at the Newport Folk Festival recently. And when she sang the Circle Game, which I always find to be just an incredibly Buddhist song about how everything changes over time. First, you're fairly young, and then you're 10, and then you're 16, and then you're in your 20s. Of course, that's as far as she went when she wrote the song. But, we all keep going on the Circle Game and just keep having a new round of experiences. But at some point, the circle will come to an end of this life. In Buddhist terms, we go on to another life. We have another existence, and it keeps going. But it's always in motion. The circle is always turning. So these are, again, the context for what we're going to be looking at in terms of the nature of grief. Another thing that I did want to share from Guy Newland's book, because he touches on this towards the beginning too. And those of you who have dealt with a very personal loss, something that was very challenging for you to go through, or those of you who are going through that right now, no doubt you feel a little bit of this. And let me read from this. I think it's really kind of nice to read his words. He says, "From within our grief world, our private pain feels like a singularity, as though with no bones we collapse, cut off from the willfully unwitting inhabitants of the utterly oblivious world. In my case, I felt as though I were undergoing something extremely strange, like a secret LSD experiment. I was alienated from everyone who seemed not to have been or could not acknowledge being in this world of utter loss." And he talks about how this book that he wrote is about that isolating sense of specialness. It is about awakening from the delusion that our pain is a private prison. When I recall back on my own experience of grief after Ed's passing, there was that sort of feeling cut off from the world, feeling like what I was going through, as much as others would try to be present with me or spend time with me and understand me, was very different from what their understanding was. And of course, that's why I found a support group where you're with other people who are newly grieving a loss. You find other people who you can identify with who can speak to that. But that begins to enlarge your perspective, to take you out of that sense of this being your sort of own little special isolated experience into something that is experienced by many, many others. But there's a tension between that, because again, I don't want to in any way infer that we should be denying the specialness of our own experience. The grief that you've experienced or are experiencing now in your life is your own unique experience to a great degree. No one can speak to all of what you're going through day in and day out and adjusting to losses and what have you. But nonetheless, we can begin to also recognize that others are on that same journey with us, on that same path, that path of healing. So this is another dimension in terms of the nature of grief, to really get once more that there's two dimensions to it. The more unique individual perspective that we have that perhaps no one will ever fully know. But then we also have the commonality that we share with others. And I'm hoping that that comes through also within this weekend. As I said, I'll be encouraging any of you who wish to explore your own individual experience around grief with others, but then also, to be acknowledging that we're all here because we're in this common predicament. We're in this shared experience, and to recognize that that is one of the values of coming together to explore this. Um, when I did this for the group up in Colorado and Denver, Lama Yeshe House, almost, it was a little over a year ago, last July, we actually even formed a support group out of that went on for not quite a year. But it was important for people to know that they could be with others and kind of continue to explore this idea. Because even in our culture, as much as, yes, they do have grief support groups and they have grief counselors and a lot of people who can help with your process, I think sometimes it does help if you're exploring things from a particular perspective, like a Buddhist understanding, to be with others who share that understanding. Again, not something that the FPMT has offered to a larger scale. And so it is important that you kind of have that in the back of your mind too. Perhaps that will be something that will come out of this group as well. So I think I've talked a lot so far. What I want to do before we go too far, I do want to have an opportunity for some of you to share anything that came up for you with regard to anything that I've said so far, talking a little bit about the nature of grief, various perspectives on grief that I've already shared. But I want to share this one sort of exercise that I'm going to encourage you to do on your own, though I may also lead you in it at certain times during the weekend. And it's what we call a regulation exercise. By regulation, we mean kind of regulating the body and the mind a little bit. But we use the body and the breath to do this. We can all maybe do this together right now. And again, at the beginning of tonight, we did that little meditation. We were examining where we were physically, but perhaps now, and over an hour later, we're in a very different space physically. So it's good first just to kind of sort of sit quietly and be present. Kind of put your right hand over your heart, right at that heart chakra. And then your left hand can be somewhere down over around your abdomen, just wherever it's comfortable. And don't, press with your hands, but begin to notice the weight of your hands that are pressing on your body right now. And as you breathe, keep your focus on how heavy your hands feel. And you may or may not feel warmth under your hands, but just simply continue feeling the weight of your hands, even as there's a shift in your breath, and just kind of be present with this and pay attention to the breath and see if you notice that shift. When that shift comes, then you are regulated. And you can continue this feeling of regulation for a bit until we move on to what we will be doing next. Just stay in that space. If you haven't experienced that shift yet, just kind of be present with the breathing. If you have, then just simply stay present with feeling regulated. And then we'll come back into the space. You can drop the hands. So again, this exercise I did learn from someone. It was when we were kind of going through a workshop on kind of challenging issues and things. This is something you can use at any time. You can just simply put your hand over your heart, the left hand on the abdomen, and just breathe, feeling the weight of your hands. Did everyone feel a sort of sense of a shift in the breath when you were doing that? Yeah. So again, this is just something to keep in mind, especially if you start to feel kind of emotions coming up. I do want to warn people that as we deal with this topic, sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't, but certainly there is that possibility for us to get very deeply into feelings, and perhaps some tears, perhaps some deep sadness will emerge. Perhaps even some joy will emerge, but at times when we feel like we need to regulate, we need to kind of put things a little bit back in balance, we do this. It's not to stuff those feelings. I'm not wanting you to do that at all. It's just to feel a sense of kind of being able to come back into the present moment and to kind of be with all of that. Because I think it is important as we continue to be with each other that we honor that, honor the opportunity for people to share whatever it is you're going through, whatever is coming up for you, but also to understand that we have a way to come back into the space and kind of put a kind of a period to that, if you will. Maybe it's more of a comma, but essentially just some sort of a division between what you might be feeling and an ability to move on. So let me open it up to any sharing that anyone would like to do. Again, feel free to let us know if you'd like us to pause the recording, but anything that came up for you in any of this that I've shared so far, the initial sort of stories that set the stage for exploring grief, what have you, as well as the nature of grief that we looked at with those slides and discussion. Anyone?
I'll share. One common thing for me, my experience is it just feels really lonely now that my mom has passed away. She's not gone. And as far as like accepting the grief, it's gotten easier because it's not as fresh. But I just feel like sometimes, now that my family I don't see them, my brothers, my aunt anymore as much. It just, I don't know, I have this feeling where it's like it kind of transitioned from grief to, what's the point of living? And it sounds kind of dark, but I just don't, I don't know. I just, that's my observation. And I don't know if that's like a different stage of grieving or if it's like a temporary stage.
Yeah, definitely. It is one of the stages of grieving that, again, we'll talk about. One of the problems with putting a structure like this together is that things come up that it's best just to maybe go ahead and talk about them earlier rather than later. I mean, one of the things to understand about these 5 stages of grieving, and then of course a 6th stage that David Kessler has added onto it, is that it's not a linear process by any means. There are certainly some things that happen that maybe cause one of the other stages to manifest, but oftentimes we come circling back around and experience things newly depending upon what happens in our lives. But definitely the stage of what she called depression, which of course encompasses all levels of sort of sadness, loneliness, the real pain of what we're experiencing in loss. There's some element of that throughout from the very beginning all the way even until we are more or less through some sort of processing, but continue to have the grief. As I said, it doesn't go away. It just becomes perhaps, again, we're a bit bigger. The space for it is a bit larger so that it doesn't feel quite as intense. But definitely having some feelings of depression and sadness and loneliness are a part of the process. And once more, I think our culture doesn't do such a good job of acknowledging that part of it. It's very hard for people to be with other people's sadness. In fact, many people, this whole subject of how do we deal with others in their grief, it's really important that we allow the space for people to feel what they're feeling. And if they're feeling depressed and sad and lonely, that's acknowledged. It is natural that people do have that as part of the experience of grief. And to not kind of want to, oh, well, you really should get over that. Have you thought about going out for a walk? Have you thought about doing this or whatever? I mean, sometimes it's good to suggest things in a very gentle way, but a lot of times people suggest them from the point of view of not being willing to witness that pain themselves. And it is very hard, we know from our own experience, to be with others in that space. But this is why Buddhism has a lot of tools to help us as well. Mindful presence is really important to be able to be with others, to shut off all of our own thoughts and processing, to be with the other person fully with the undivided attention, just in the same way that we do that with our breath or with anything that we meditate on. That same skill can be used to be with others more genuinely with a much more open heart. And so it's understandable, again, Vanessa, that you're going through those feelings because they are a part of the process. And they do need to be worked with, to go through them, to understand that they're natural to feel. Now, of course, one of the things we have to balance there too as well is if the depression becomes something that becomes more kind kind of inhibits one's ability to kind of move on and continue to do the things that one does, then perhaps some intervention might be necessary in terms of others who have skills that go beyond what we can do in the course of a weekend here. But certainly, it's natural for people to be sad, to feel that sense of loneliness. And it's even natural for people to feel what you express, Vanessa, of, kind of what's the point? Why do I need to keep living? Those thoughts come up very frequently for those who are grieving, simply because so much of what gave them meaning in their life has been taken away, and they no longer have that. That's why it's really quite comforting. I'm pretty much done with David Kessler's book. I skipped a little bit in the middle, but his book on finding meaning as being the 6th stage of grieving, which again is something that is not emphasized maybe quite as much, as to be able to process what we have learned from our grief, all stages of our grief, even our depression, and to funnel it into what do we do with that? How do we actually come back out into a new stage of our own being, as I said, a bit bigger, a bit more expansive in our own goals and our own aims of what we would like to do. Some people do something very profound when they have the experience of the loss of a loved one. I don't know how these parents deal with losing their children in these school shootings and things, but you see what happened at Parkland in Florida, where there was the parents and the children, many of them who were witnesses to their own classmates being killed, who put all of their energy now into gun control and helping to, change things in this country so that these sorts of disasters don't happen again. Not just gun control, but the whole range of things that are involved in all of that. But the idea is that some people will feel that sort of movement, that their depression, their sadness, they see the light at the end of the tunnel as being something that compels them to do something more meaningful from the loss of their loved one. But other people simply put energy into their own life and their own dedication to others and the work that they do and the things that how they contribute to society and the world and what have you. It's important that each of us find that. For me, it was finding the Buddhist path and eventually becoming a teacher, because I felt like I couldn't continue to do what I was doing up to that point in my life. I stayed on for a few years working at Levi Strauss and what have you, but I really wanted something that had more meaning. And I think that's the value of these sorts of experiences that come up in grief. But every one of us will be on our own sort of trajectory in terms of what the various stages teach us. But there's a lot to learn from being in that place of darkness and depression that is not a pleasant place to be. But one of the things that I was on my little list here to go through as well, when we talk about the necessity of grief, is that the only way through grief is, or to the other side, is going through. You have to actually experience it. You have to actually go through the various stages. You have to actually feel the loss and the various dimensions of that loss. Otherwise, again, we're sort of circumventing it. There's a term that's used by John Wellwood, another Tibetan Buddhist practitioner who's a psychologist, and he calls it spiritual bypassing, and this is a form of it, where we essentially think that we can use all these lofty spiritual teachings to just kind of circumvent our own difficulties and pain and garbage, and kind of move to the other side without any need to process all of that. Well, we do have to process it. We do have to feel that isolation, that loneliness, that sadness, and then come out the other side. Recognize that, again, there will be other waves of sadness. There will be other waves of grief that we have to go through. But it will change over time, especially as we take what we're experiencing and try to find deeper meaning and purpose in our own lives. Oftentimes it really helps to think about, for example, your mother, Vanessa, and what she would want for you at this time. This is something that's a very valuable exercise. If we think about our loved ones and those who we cared for and really honored and loved and respected in our lives, we know that they had that same love and honor and respect and care for us as well. And that they would certainly want for us to continue to do the work, to continue to heal, to continue to move through these feelings and to not get stuck in them. But as was said, the only way to get to that other side is to go through. We can't circumvent all of that. And so it's painful, it's hard. There are many times where, again, just getting out of bed can be difficult for people who are grieving. But we keep doing it. We keep doing the work. And have some curiosity as well to see what will be on the other side. What will it look like? I mean, if I had said to myself, prior to Ed's passing, that I'd be in this position now, some 30 years down the road, I don't know that I even would have believed it. I would have just been, But if we're open to just the possibility of what life can still have for us and have in store for us and what will unfold for us, then I think we can kind of keep our hearts open in the midst of that. Does that help a little bit, Vanessa, to kind of give some context for that?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
We will touch on all of these stages when we get to that part of it, kind of the process of grieving. But know that it's not by any means linear. We don't start off in here and then we go to there and then eventually we get on the other side and it's over. I think one of the differences too, this I may touch on again later when we get to that, is when we talk about the 5 stages in regard to death, this is when you yourself are facing your own mortality. And of course, they're probably experienced more profoundly when someone is given a prognosis that they then have to prepare for their own death in a more tangible way. As Buddha teaches, we're all subject to death and could die at any moment, any time, any day. But nonetheless, when people have that horizon of we've got 6 months to live or a year to live, then this process you go through much more kind of discreetly to some degree. It's not to say again that it's completely linear there either, but nonetheless, there's there is an end point that you're getting to, which is your eventual death. With grief, it's not the same thing at all, right? Because our lives can go on for many, many years after we've lost those that we love. And so there's not this kind of final point that you get to and you go, okay, well then I've got the work done. Now I'm ready to go. Well, we'll all get to our own death, but that's not what we're aiming for in processing our grief. We're processing the grief and healing from the grief so we can integrate it fully into our lives, come out the other side with that love and experience kind of embodied in our way of being. So it's a very different thing in that regard. So anyone else want to share anything? We got about another 5 minutes or so tonight. Anything that came up from anything you've heard tonight or thought about? Yeah, please, Carol. And you'll need to unmute yourself, Carol. Yeah. Thank you. There you go.
My husband was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. And although he never would let me go to the doctor with him, so I never knew that actually until after he passed away, just before. But there was a period of time, about 3 months before he passed away, when a series of tests came back and it was very clear that we were in a short time period. And what I found for myself, this was so interesting when you were talking, that I actually did the grieving before he passed, one stage or one type of grieving that lasted for like 3 days for me. And then I came out like the other side of that, so that when he passed, and he passed very peacefully, thank God, and he came home for hospice the day before everything shut down from COVID. He was out of the hospital the day before. If he had not come out that time, I would never have been able to see him again. So when he passed, it was actually, in a way, I think of relief and grief as these parallel things that happened during that time. And the actual grieving or that deep, painful stuff I felt had happened a couple months actually before he went. And then after he went, of course, there was another whole level and a different type of grief. And I find now it's been almost 2 years, and I'm very peaceful with that because he was such a peaceful guy. He wasn't a Buddhist, but he was in so many ways. But I wonder if you could address that kind of that pre-grief, that thing, this is coming, and there's a part of you that begins to accept and understand that, which actually helped the actual passing. But then another whole type of grief happened after that. I just wanted to share that, see if anybody else maybe had experienced anything like that.
I would say, Carol, that's actually a very common experience, particularly when you do have that window of opportunity, when you know that death is on the horizon and can adjust your mind to that. Oftentimes they refer to that as anticipatory grief, because
Oh.
to some degree we are going through that even when, like with my mom isn't dealing with anything that she's been diagnosed with that is putting death on the immediate horizon, but at 92, she's got a
Oh, yeah.
much more higher likelihood of something happening than I do at my age. So, you know, the this anticipatory grief can help us in terms of going through that process. But as you pointed out, and I think this is also what many people say, once you get to the other side of it, you may think you're sort of finished to some degree with what happens, but you have a new
You're not.
experience. You have a different experience, because once more the reality of them actually not being in your life is much more stark and palpable than the anticipation of that happening. But the anticipation of it happening is a part of the process that is very useful as well. It helps us to once more not feel the suddenness of it so deeply. This is where once more I think about parents again whose children have been gunned down, or anyone who's died in a very sudden way, and the adjustment that that person has to do to that loss like that. You know, they spoke to them at breakfast in the morning, and then they aren't there at dinner in the evening. You know, there's actually a really interesting book I read during the pandemic. Some of you may have read it, by Joan Didion. The book is called where I had it here.
Magical thinking.
Yeah, Year of Magical Thinking.
I know that. Yeah, I know that.
You know, and she
Beautiful
talks
book.
about the very beginning of it. You know, I have it here. She just talks about, you know, life changes fast. Life changes in the instant. You sit down to dinner, and life as you know it ends. You know, and that's the big thing, is life as you know it ends, regardless of how much time you have for it. But if you don't have that time, think of how much harder it is to adjust to that reality. The anticipation that you had an experience and that allowed you to go through some intense grief of being able to be with the reality of his passing and knowing that that was going to occur, and then to actually, again, be ready to some degree for that, but once more have a whole new experience on the other side of it. And again, this is quite natural. I think it's something that most people will do. Some people don't want to face that reality, though. They'll be in that stage of denial right up until something happens. And then on the other side, they have to deal with all of the other emotions that will come up. But it's good that you were able to do that to some degree. Again, it doesn't in any way get rid of the grief that happens afterwards, but it perhaps prepares one a little bit better.
I think it taught me, my key word became surrender.
Mm-hmm.
You know, surrender when the feelings and those moments of sadness or anger or whatever, you know, came up, to just accept it and then breathe it out.
That's
Thank
wonderful. No, that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that, Carol, and for especially what you just added. I think surrendering to the feeling is really an important part of it. You know, so many people once more have a resistance to these types of feelings. You know, the depression, sadness, that loneliness that Vanessa was speaking of, what have you. We don't want to go to those places, right? We don't feel good in those places. But if we don't experience those things, if we don't open up our heart and surrender to those feelings, it's going to be unprocessed. And unprocessed grief affects us mentally, but it affects us physically as well. You know, and those things get held onto in our minds and in our bodies, and they don't come out until we do the work. So yeah,
Another way
Yeah,
to think of that are the waves of grief, that grief comes up in waves, which is what
Yes.
and so it's just letting the wave wash over you, and then that wave is done, and my experience is that the waves become further and further apart from each other. So at first there's lots of waves, and then the waves happen less frequently, and then they get smaller over time.
They get smaller. That's overwhelming.
Yeah. And I think that's the general experience, though. It's not to say that it will necessarily always unfold that way. Sometimes people have an unexpected experience that triggers a bigger wave. Suddenly that wave seems to almost come out of nowhere.
Oh, yeah, for sure, for sure.
Yeah. And so I used to describe grief, and the one, I don't know who I described it to, but I've used this frequently. But when I was going through my own grief, I called grief a strange animal that shows up at weird hours of the day. It just kind of like will be there all of a sudden, and you don't know where it came from even necessarily, but for some reason it's something you have to tend to, you have to kind of deal with because it's there on your doorstep and it calls for your attention.
Yeah.
I remember one of the experiences I had with Ed. Ed was so funny. He would collect, whenever he was out, he'd try to get 50-cent pieces and he would give them to me, and I put them in a little piggy bank that I had. And so this was just something that he did. And I thought that was just very precious and made some endearment that I had for him. And so when he was gone, of course, I wasn't getting my 50-cent pieces. And there was some time, I don't know when it was, but it was in the period after his death, maybe a few months after or something. And I go into a store and the cashier hands me a 50-cent piece back in change. And I just about lost it right there in the store because, I hadn't gotten a 50-cent piece since then, since his passing. And to tell you the truth, I haven't gotten one since. They don't use them so much anymore these days, but this was back in 92. I think they were still being circulated a bit more perhaps, but there can be these little things that all of a sudden it's like you're back in that moment, back in that initial being with the person in their death, whatever's going on, and all that feeling is fresh again. May not last as long, but certainly it can come back in those other waves. But yeah, it's like waves. I think David Kessler calls these bursts even. I don't know if I like the word burst as much as waves, but he says there are grief bursts and there are also love bursts. This is from page 202 of his book, Finding Meaning, that I mentioned earlier. I often talk about grief bursts. Even though someone may think they put the worst of their grief behind them, they have moments when, seemingly out of the blue, they burst into tears, overwhelmed with feelings of loss. These moments are all the more painful because they're so unexpected and people are often caught off balance by them. Then he says, contrary to what he says, there will be times when you will suddenly well up with love for the person you lost. You may feel that love has nowhere to go because you can't hold your loved one, but the love continues. So again, this is what he calls it, the love bursts as well. And it's important to be, aware of that we can have those coming up with regard to our own experiences. Grief is not something that, again, you just goes away completely and you've dealt with it and don't ever see it again. It manifests, and certainly our love for the other person manifests as well. Okay, so we have gone just a little bit over, and I really want to keep it to at least pretty tight within the time frame that we had set. So if you do have some additional comments or questions, please take note of them. Otherwise, it'll be like me forgetting where I was at earlier. Hopefully, I'll be better tomorrow and Sunday in the earlier part of the day. But so what we'll do is we'll be convening again at 10 o'clock Pacific time tomorrow. In the Mountain Time Zone here, it's 11 o'clock, and that'll be 2 hours. We will have a short break in there. Just so that people get a chance to get up and stretch. I find 2-hour Zoom sessions are really hard for people to sit through. Even this hour and a half, I'm sure, is challenging. So we'll do that tomorrow as part of it. So in the meantime, again, feel free to do this regulation exercise after we conclude. If you want to just sort of ground yourself, might again have brought up some feelings and what we've already talked about. And it's important to take care of yourself and to nurture yourself as we go through this bit of workshop that we're doing this weekend. So just have some thoughts of sort of closing tonight. Last hour and a half we spent with this good motivation, this idea that we're here to work on ourselves, on our own healing, but also to be a source of healing and support for others. So through what we've done here even tonight, may this come to pass. May we be able to heal ourselves to the greatest degree. And the Buddha says we have the potential to do very profound healing, but at least may we find the healing that we seek, and may we help others to also find the healing that they desire. Okay, wonderful. Thank you all for being here tonight. And again, we'll continue in the morning. And again, feel free to bring in questions. I'll try to, have enough time in there for people to ask questions. I've got a bit of agenda to cover, but I'm not attached to it. Willing to go with the flow and see what happens for people and what you'd like to explore over the course of this time together. All right, everyone, be well. Have a nice evening, and I'll see you
Namaste.
Thank you,
tomorrow.
Don. Thanks,
You're
Vanessa.
very welcome.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you again, Don.
Thank you. All right. Thanks, Vanessa. Bye-bye.